What if the first human being was never truly alone? Most people imagine Eden as a private paradise where God walked with Adam in perfect isolation, just creator and creation enjoying unbroken fellowship. But Scripture hints at something more complex, something that changes everything we thought we knew about the beginning. Genesis 3:8 tells us Adam and Eve heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Heard a voice that warped. That unusual phrasing has puzzled scholars for thousands of years. In this exploration, we will move through 3 decisive stages. First, we will discover who else was present in Eden from the very beginning, witnesses humanity never knew existed. Then we will uncover why these beings were placed there and what their original purpose revealed about God's greater plan. Finally, we will trace how their presence in the garden connects directly to the spiritual battles we face today. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The Hebrew Scriptures preserve a mystery that most Sunday school lessons never touch. When we read about Eden, we picture 2 humans, various animals, and God Himself occasionally visiting His creation. Clean, simple, peaceful. But the ancient Jewish understanding of these texts included an awareness that the spiritual realm was densely populated, layered, complex. Eden was not just a garden, it was an intersection point, a place where heaven and earth overlapped, where the visible and invisible realms touched. The temple imagery woven throughout the Eden narrative suggests this. The garden faced eastward, just like the later tabernacle. Cherubim guarded its entrance after the fall, just as cherubim would later guard the Holy of Holies. Adam's role was to work and keep the garden, using the same Hebrew words later applied to priestly duties in the sanctuary. Eden was temple space, and temples are never empty of spiritual presence. When Genesis 1:26 records God saying, "Let us make man in our image," generations of theologians have debated that plural pronoun. Some suggest it reflects the Trinity. Others propose it indicates the royal we common in ancient Near Eastern court language. But there is a third possibility, one that ancient Jewish interpreters took seriously. God was speaking to His divine council, the assembly of spiritual beings who surrounded His throne and participated in the governance of creation. We see this council explicitly in passages like 1 Kings 22, where the prophet Micaiah describes seeing the Lord on His throne with all the host of heaven standing beside Him. We encounter it in Job 1, where the sons of God present themselves before the Lord and Satan comes among them. We find it in Psalm 82, where God takes His place in the divine council and judges among the gods. This was not fringe theology. This was mainstream ancient Israelite cosmology. Heaven had ranks, orders, authorities, and functions, and some of those spiritual beings had assignments that involved earth directly. Subscribe now, because what comes next will completely reshape how you read the opening chapters of Genesis. The beings we are about to discuss are mentioned in Scripture, but their story has been largely forgotten, ignored, or deliberately suppressed. These were not ordinary angels. They belonged to a specific order with a specific function. They were called Watchers. The term appears most explicitly in Daniel 4:13, where King Nebuchadnezzar describes his dream. "I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven." The Aramaic word used here is ear, meaning one who is awake, one who watches. These beings did not sleep. They did not blink. They observed continuously, maintaining constant vigilance over the affairs of creation. But their story begins much earlier than Daniel. It begins in Eden itself, in those silent moments between the verses, in the gaps where Scripture hints at realities it does not fully explain. Jewish tradition preserved in texts like the Book of Enoch, once widely read and quoted by early church fathers, expands on this. These watchers were assigned as observers from the very beginning. They witnessed the creation of humanity. They saw Adam take his first breath. They watched as God formed Eve from Adam's side. They were there. Think about what this means. Adam wakes up in paradise, sees the sky, feels the ground beneath him, names the animals, tends the garden. He thinks he is alone with God. but invisible to him, arrayed in the spiritual dimension that overlaps his physical reality, there stand ranks of celestial witnesses, watching his every choice, recording his every word, observing the unfolding of this grand experiment called humanity. And among these watchers, something begins to stir. Not all observation is neutral, not all watching is passive. When you observe something beautiful, something fascinating, something that possesses qualities you lack, observation can become desire, and desire, when it crosses boundaries, becomes transgression. The watchers saw humanity. They saw the image of God reflected in flesh and blood. They saw freedom, embodiment, creativity, relationship. They saw something they themselves did not possess, and in at least some of them, that observation kindled a dangerous fire. Now here is where the story gets disturbing. The presence of these watchers in Eden was not accidental. God placed them there. Their surveillance was authorized, ordained, purposeful. But why? Why would the Creator position spiritual observers around humanity? What was the point of this cosmic scrutiny? The answer relates to something most modern Christians have forgotten. Creation was a demonstration, a display, a theater. Paul tells us in Ephesians 3:10 that through the church the manifold wisdom of God is now made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. The spiritual realm learns about God through watching what he does with humanity. If that is true in the church age, how much more true was it at the beginning when humanity was brand new, when the very concept of a physical being bearing the divine image was unprecedented? The watchers observed because creation itself was a message, a revelation, or unveiling of God's nature and purposes. Humanity was lesson 1, and every being in heaven was watching to see how it would unfold. But surveillance creates pressure. Being watched changes behavior. Athletes perform differently when they know scouts are in the stands. Students act differently when teachers are present. And humanity, whether Adam knew it or not, was under constant observation from the moment of creation. The choices made in Eden were not private decisions. They were cosmic events witnessed by multitudes. When Eve stood before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she was not alone. When Adam chose to eat alongside her, the decision echoed through dimensions humanity could not perceive. The watchers saw everything, and at least some of them did not merely observe. They began to interfere. Before we move forward, understand this. The narrative you have been taught about Eden, about the fall, about the early chapters of Genesis, is incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. There were more players on the stage than you realized, more witnesses to the first sin, more observers recording the first lie, the first shame, the first broken promise between Creator and creation. And those observers did not disappear after the garden gates closed. They followed humanity into the world beyond Eden. Some remained loyal to their calling, others abandoned it, and the consequences of that choice would drown the world in blood. Comment below if you have ever felt watched in a spiritual sense, as if unseen eyes were tracking your choices. You might be more right than you know. Chapter 2. Before the garden was a garden, long before soil was shaped or seeds were planted, before the first tree stretched toward light or the first river carved its path through land, there was counsel, there was deliberation, there was planning. Genesis 1 inquest, ottings with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But between that grand opening statement and the detailed work of the 6 days lies an ocean of untold reality. What happened in that space? What existed before Eden? Before we can understand who was watching humanity, we need to understand what came before humanity. Before Adam opened his eyes, whole orders of spiritual beings already existed, already served, already worshipped. Angels were not created on day 6 alongside humans. They were present long before. How do we know this? Job 38 provides a crucial clue. When God responds to Job's questions, he asks, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it?" on what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The morning stars sang. The sons of God shouted for joy. At the foundation of the earth, spiritual beings were already present, already celebrating, already participating in the grand unveiling of creation. They were witnesses to the birth of the cosmos. This tells us something essential. The spiritual realm existed before the physical realm. Heaven preceded earth, and by the time humanity appeared, angelic orders were already ancient, already established, already organized into ranks and functions we barely comprehend. Paul references these ranks in Ephesians and Colossians. Thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, authorities. These were not vague poetic terms. They described real hierarchies, real roles, real beings with real assignments. Among these orders were the Watchers. Their role was unique, not messengers like Gabriel who carried announcements, not warriors like Michael who led heavenly armies, not worship leaders like the seraphim who cried, "Holy, holy," without ceasing. The Watchers observed, they recorded, they bore witness, and their jurisdiction, at least in part, involved earth. When God said, "Let us make man in our image," that decision was not made in a vacuum. It was made in council, with the full awareness and participation of the divine assembly. The spiritual beings surrounding God's throne heard the plan. They understood what was about to happen. Humanity was not just another creature. Humanity was something entirely new. The image of God, placed in flesh, finite yet bearing the mark of the infinite, mortal yet destined for eternity, physical yet spiritual. This was revolutionary, unprecedented, shocking. Imagine the reaction among the angelic hosts. Some, surely, responded with wonder and worship. God's creativity knew no bounds. His decision to share his image with physical beings demonstrated love beyond comprehension. But others might have responded differently, with confusion, with questions, perhaps even with jealousy. Why would God elevate these physical creatures? Why grant them his image? Why give them authority to rule over creation, as Genesis 1:28 commands? Angels were older, more powerful, more knowledgeable. Yet here comes humanity, fresh and new, receiving privileges and honors that celestial beings did not possess. Like this video, the idea of ancient spiritual beings debating humanity's creation gives you chills, because that tension did not stay theoretical, it became action. This is where the story of the Watchers darkens. At some point, observation turned into obsession. Witnesses became participants. Boundaries were crossed. According to the Book of Enoch, a text quoted in the New Testament by Jude and referenced by early church fathers like Tertullian and Origen, 200 watchers made a pact. They agreed together to descend from their assigned posts and take human wives. This was not a spontaneous mistake. It was a coordinated rebellion, a deliberate violation of the created order. Genesis 6:1-4 preserves a trace of this event. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." Sons of God. In the Hebrew, B'nai Elohim. This term appears multiple times in the Old Testament, almost always referring to angelic beings. Job 1006, Job 2:1, Job 38:7 all use the same term for spiritual beings in God's presence. Yet here in Genesis 6, these sons of God are taking human wives and producing offspring. The result? Nephilim. The word means fallen ones, giants, hybrids, beings that should never have existed. This union was not just immoral, It was ontologically catastrophic. It violated the boundaries between heaven and earth, between spirit and flesh. It introduced corruption at the deepest levels of creation, and it forced God to act. But before the judgment, before the flood, before the cleansing, there was a moment, a decision point. The Watchers stood at the boundary between their realm and ours. They knew the rules, they understood the consequences, and they chose rebellion anyway. Why? What could possibly be worth abandoning their position, their purpose, their place in the divine order? The answer lies in what they saw. They saw humanity. They saw the image of God in physical form. They saw beauty, freedom, creativity, intimacy. They saw something that awakened desire, and that desire became an all-consuming fire. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this, because the church has stayed silent on these truths for too long. The early chapters of Genesis are not simple moral tales. They are records of cosmic war, of boundaries violated, of divine order challenged and divine judgment executed. The Watchers were not minor characters. They were central players in a drama that would reshape the entire trajectory of human history. And their story did not end with the flood. It continues. Threads of their rebellion weave through the Old Testament, into the New, and reach forward into our time. The eyes that watched Eden still watch today. The beings who crossed boundaries in the ancient past still seek to cross them now. But now they use different methods, different disguises, different doorways. We will get to that. But first, we need to understand what happened next. Because after the Watchers fell, after they took human wives, after the Nephilim were born, the world descended into chaos. Violence filled the earth. Every intention of the thoughts of humanity's heart was only evil continually, and God looked down at the wreckage of his creation and grieved. Genesis 6:6, as the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. That grief was not weakness. It was love confronting corruption. And love, when confronted with corruption that threatens the beloved, acts decisively. The flood was coming, but it was not just about humanity's sin. It was about cleansing the genetic and spiritual contamination introduced by the Watchers. It was about removing the Nephilim, those hybrid abominations whose very existence mocked the created order. And it was about imprisoning the Watchers themselves, locking them away in darkness until the final judgment. At least that was the plan. But did it work completely? Were all the Watchers imprisoned? Did all the Nephilim perish? Or did something survive? Stay with me, because the answer is more disturbing than you might expect. Chapter 3, the council that spoke creation. We must go back further still. Before the Watchers fell, before humanity existed, before Eden was planted, we must go back to the council chamber of eternity, to the throne room of the Most High, where decisions that shape reality itself are made. Because the story of the Watchers cannot be understood without first understanding the divine council, the heavenly assembly where God governs his creation in the presence of spiritual beings who serve him. This concept makes modern Christians uncomfortable. We prefer a simpler picture. God alone, sovereign, acting independently, needing no counsel, no input, no participation from created beings. And in terms of ultimate authority, that picture is correct. God needs nothing and no one. His decisions are final, his wisdom perfect, his power absolute. But the scriptures reveal that God chooses to govern through council, through assembly, through a heavenly court where spiritual beings have roles, voices, and functions. Psalm 82:1 declares, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. The Hebrew word for council here is adat el, literally the assembly of God. The gods mentioned are not rivals to Yahweh. They are Elohim, spiritual beings, members of the heavenly host. The psalm continues, showing God judging these beings for their failures. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. This is staggering. Spiritual beings, called gods and sons of the Most High, are held accountable by the true God. They have responsibilities. They can fail. And when they fail, they face judgment. 1 Kings 22 gives us another glimpse into this council. The prophet Micaiah tells King Ahab, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then the Spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Here we see God presiding over a council where spiritual beings discuss strategy, volunteer for assignments, and receive divine authorization to act. This is not mythology. This is the biblical worldview. Heaven is organized. There are ranks, roles, deliberations, decisions. When we come to Genesis 1026 and hear God say, let us make man in our image after our likeness, we must understand this was spoken in that council. The divine assembly heard the plan. They knew what was about to happen, and the use of the plural, let us, our image, our likeness, indicates that in some mysterious way, these beings participated in or at least witnessed this creative decree. Now here is the crucial point. When humanity was created in the image of God, that image was placed in physical form in a way that had never happened before. Angels are spiritual beings. They serve in God's presence. They carry out His commands. They worship continuously, but they do not bear the image of God in the same way humanity does. Humans are embodied image bearers. We are finite replicas of the infinite God, placed in creation to rule, steward, and represent Him. This elevated status caused reactions in the spiritual realm. Some angels rejoiced, others questioned, and at least some, over time, developed something darker: envy, desire, rebellion. Subscribe if this is making you rethink everything you thought you knew about Genesis, because the Watchers were members of this divine council. They had a specific role within the heavenly government. Their title, Watchers, describes their function. In Daniel 4, when Nebuchadnezzar recounts his dream, he mentions these beings explicitly. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. The Aramaic term is Aya, meaning wakeful one who never sleeps. These beings maintained constant vigilance. They observed the unfolding of God's plans on earth. They reported back. They bore witness. They ensured that divine decrees were executed properly. In a sense, they were the eyes and ears of heaven, positioned to monitor creation and ensure alignment with God's will. This was a high calling, a sacred trust, to be given access to the unfolding drama of creation. To watch as God's purposes played out in real time was an extraordinary privilege. But privilege creates responsibility, and responsibility, when violated, brings judgment. The Book of Enoch, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and quoted in the New Testament Book of Jude, provides detailed accounts of how the Watchers fell. Enoch 6 begins the story. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Samajah, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. It was premeditated rebellion. 200 watchers, led by Semjazer, made a covenant to violate the boundary between heaven and earth. They descended to Mount Hermon, a location whose name means devoted to destruction. They took human wives, and they began to produce offspring that were never meant to exist. But before they descended, they were in the council. They heard God's decrees. They watched the creation of Adam and Eve. They observed the fall in Eden. They saw humanity multiply across the earth. And somewhere in that watching, something twisted. Observation became obsession. Duty became desire. And the very beings tasked with guarding the boundaries chose to obliterate them. Comment below if you have ever wondered why God allows spiritual beings to have free will, because that question is at the heart of this entire story. The Watchers were not programmed robots. They were persons with agency, capable of choice, capable of loyalty or betrayal, and they chose betrayal. Why does this matter to us today? Because the same dynamics that led to the fall of the Watchers are still at work in the spiritual realm. Boundaries still exist between heaven and earth, between the spiritual and physical, between the holy and the profane. And spiritual beings, both fallen and faithful, still operate around those boundaries. The question is not whether we live in a world where spiritual forces are active. The question is whether we recognize their activity and align ourselves accordingly. The divine council still meets. God still governs. Spiritual beings still carry out assignments. And humanity, whether we realize it or not, still lives under the watchful gaze of the unseen realm. The Watchers fell, but their fall revealed something profound about the cosmos. Creation is not neutral ground. It is contested space. And every human choice, every moral decision, every act of worship or rebellion echoes into dimensions we cannot see. We are never alone. We are always observed. The only question that matters is this: by whom? Chapter 4. When heaven sent witnesses. Let us be clear about what the Watchers were before they became what they are. They were holy. They were set apart. They stood in the presence of the living God and carried out his purposes without flaw. Daniel 4:13 calls them a watcher, a holy one, confirming that their original state was purity and righteousness. They belonged to the heavenly host, that vast assembly of spiritual beings who serve the Most High. But among all the orders of angels, seraphim who worship, cherubim who guard, messengers who announce, warriors who fight, the Watchers had a unique calling. They were sent to observe humanity. Their mission was surveillance, not for cruelty, not for control, but for testimony. They were witnesses in the most legal sense of the word. When God established his covenant with humanity, when he set boundaries and expectations, when he gave commands and promises, the Watchers were there to record what happened next. Would humanity obey? Would they honor the Creator? Would they fulfill their calling to be image bearers, stewards, rulers under God's authority? These were not abstract questions. The entire spiritual realm was watching to see how the human experiment would unfold. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 4:9, "We have become a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men." If that was true of the apostles, how much more true was it of Adam and Eve in Eden? They were the first humans, the prototype, the original demonstration of what it meant to bear the image of God in flesh. Every choice they made had cosmic significance, and the Watchers were there, recording it all. Now think carefully about this. Why would God need observers? He is omniscient. He sees everything. He knows all things past, present, and future. The Watchers were not providing God with information he lacked. They were providing something else: testimony, legal witness. In the structure of divine justice, God does not act as both accuser and judge in a vacuum. He operates through order, through process, through accountability that even he submits to, not because he must, but because it reflects his character. When humanity sinned, there were witnesses. When judgment came, it was not arbitrary. It was testified, confirmed, legally established. This is why Job could demand a hearing. This is why Abraham could intercede for Sodom. This is why Moses could stand in the gap for Israel. God's justice operates within a framework that includes testimony, advocacy, judgment, and mercy. And the Watchers played a role in that framework. They were the eyes of heaven on earth. They saw the rebellion. They recorded the transgression. And when the time for judgment came, they bore witness to what they had seen. But something went catastrophically wrong. The observers became participants. The witnesses became criminals, the very beings tasked with maintaining the integrity of the boundary between heaven and earth decided to cross that boundary themselves. Genesis 6 describes the result. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Notice the language. They saw this was the core of their function, but then they desired, and then they took. Observation led to lust. Lust led to action, and action led to corruption that almost destroyed the world. Like this video, you are starting to see how the pieces of the Genesis narrative fit together in ways you never realized. The Book of Enoch elaborates on what happened next. The Watchers did not just take wives, they taught humanity forbidden knowledge. Enoch 8:1-3 records. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. Semjazar taught enchantments and root cuttings. Amaroz taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. And Sariel taught the course of the moon. This was not education, it was corruption. The Watchers revealed knowledge that humanity was not ready to possess. They gave tools of war, techniques of manipulation, secrets of the spiritual realm, insights into cosmic forces, all before humanity had the maturity or moral framework to handle them. The result was catastrophe. Violence filled the earth. Corruption spread like a plague. Humanity descended into darkness, and the offspring of these unholy unions, the Nephilim, became legends of terror. The Watchers had violated their calling at every level. They abandoned their posts. They crossed forbidden boundaries. They corrupted humanity. They produced abominations, and they introduced knowledge that empowered evil. For this, judgment came swiftly. 2 Peter 2:4 tells us, God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Jude 6 adds, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. The Watchers were imprisoned. Enoch himself was given a vision of their punishment. He saw them in chains, in darkness, in torment, awaiting final judgment. They begged him to intercede for them. They pleaded for mercy. But God's response was silence. There would be no redemption for the Watchers, no second chance, no restoration. They had seen too much. They knew too much. Their rebellion was not born of ignorance or deception. It was born of willful defiance, and so they remain, even now, locked in spiritual prisons waiting for the day when they will stand before the throne and receive their final sentence. But here is the disturbing question. Were all of them imprisoned, or did some escape? Did some find ways to continue their work from the shadows? And what about their offspring, the Nephilim? We know they existed before the flood, but Genesis 6:4 says something chilling. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, after the flood, after the judgment, after the cleansing. Somehow the corruption survived. Somehow the corruption survived. Somehow the giants returned. Somehow the legacy of the Watchers endured. And if that legacy endured then, might it endure now? Share this with someone who needs to understand that the spiritual war is older and deeper than we imagine. Chapter 5: The Silence Before the Fall. There is a moment in every tragedy when everything could still have gone differently. A pause, a breath, a final chance to turn back. The Watchers have that moment. They stood at the boundary between obedience and rebellion, between holy purpose and corrupting desire. They knew what they were about to do. They understood the consequences, and they chose to proceed anyway. This is the silence before the fall, not the fall of humanity in Eden. That came earlier. This is the fall of heaven's observers, the rebellion of beings who should have known better, who did know better, and who fell anyway. Enoch 6 describes the pact they made on Mount Hermon. 200 watchers, bound by mutual oaths, agreeing together to abandon their posts and take human wives. The leader, Semjazer, expressed fear that he would be left alone to bear the guilt, so they swore together, binding themselves by curses, ensuring that they would all share the blame and the punishment. This tells us something important. They knew it was wrong. They anticipated judgment. But they believed that if they acted together, perhaps the consequences would be lessened, or perhaps their collective rebellion would somehow justify itself. They were wrong. But in that moment before they descended, there was silence. Heaven held its breath. God did not stop them. He did not strike them down. He allowed them to choose, because choice is sacred even when the choice is catastrophic. Free will is woven into the fabric of creation. Even angels possess it. And with free will comes responsibility, consequence, and judgment. The Watchers descended. They found the daughters of men beautiful. They took wives. They began to produce offspring. And the earth began to change. Violence spread. Corruption deepened. Humanity, already broken by the fall in Eden, now faced contamination at a genetic and spiritual level. The Nephilim, giants born from the union of heaven and earth, walked the land. They were warriors, tyrants, legends. They were also abominations, beings that violated the created order, hybrids that should never have existed. Genesis 6:6 summarizes the result. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intention, only evil, continually. This was not just moral failure. This was comprehensive corruption. And at the root of it all was the decision the Watchers made in that silent moment before they fell. Subscribe if you are beginning to understand how much of the Genesis narrative has been hidden or misunderstood. Because this is not speculative fiction. This is the worldview of the ancient Israelites, the early church fathers, and the apostles themselves. Jude quotes the Book of Enoch directly. 2 Peter references the imprisonment of fallen angels. Jesus himself speaks of angels who sinned. This is biblical theology, not fringe speculation. But why does it matter? Why does the fall of the Watchers concern us today? Because their fall reveals the mechanics of corruption. It shows how spiritual beings, even those in the presence of God, can choose rebellion. It demonstrates that knowledge, power, and proximity to the divine do not guarantee faithfulness. And most importantly, it warns us that the spiritual realm is not static. It is active, dynamic, and engaged with humanity in ways we rarely recognize. The silence before the fall of the Watchers is the silence before every fall. It is the pause before the lie is told, the hesitation before the boundary is crossed, the moment when you know better but choose worse. That silence is sacred space. It is the space where repentance is still possible, where another choice can still be made, where the trajectory can still be altered. But once the silence is broken, once the step is taken, consequences follow. For the Watchers, those consequences were catastrophic: imprisonment, darkness, eternal separation from God. And for humanity, the consequences were nearly as severe: the flood, the destruction of almost all life on earth, the cleansing of a creation so corrupted that God himself grieved over it. But before the flood, there was warning. God did not act impulsively. He sent Enoch, a man who walked with God so closely that he was taken up without seeing death. Enoch preached to his generation. He warned of coming judgment. He proclaimed the holiness of God and the certainty of accountability, and according to the book that bears his name, he was also given visions of the watcher's judgment, visions he was commanded to deliver to them. Enoch saw the watchers in chains. He heard them plead for mercy. He was told to pronounce God's verdict. There would be no forgiveness, no restoration, no reprieve. Their sin was too great, their knowledge too complete, their rebellion too willful. This is a sobering truth. Not all sin is equal in consequence. Not all rebellion can be undone. The watchers crossed a line that, once crossed, could not be recrossed, and they remain, even now, in that state of judgment, waiting for the final day. But their influence did not end with their imprisonment. Their teaching spread, their offspring multiplied, and even after the flood destroyed the Nephilim, the spiritual and cultural contamination they introduced continued to echo through history. We see it in the giants who appeared in Canaan. We see it in the occult practices of pagan nations. We see it in the persistent human desire to access forbidden knowledge, to cross boundaries, to become like gods without submitting to God. The watchers may be chained, but their legacy walks free. Comment below if this is making you reconsider what spiritual warfare actually looks like. The silence before the fall is also a warning to us. We live in a world where boundaries are celebrated when they are crossed, where limits are seen as oppressive, where the idea of forbidden knowledge is mocked as primitive. But the story of the Watchers teaches us that some boundaries exist for a reason. Some knowledge is forbidden because it corrupts. Some power is withheld because we are not ready to wield it. The Watchers thought they knew better. They believed their desire justified their disobedience. They were wrong, and the world nearly drowned in the consequences of their error. We must learn from their fall. We must recognize that the silence before our own moments of decision is sacred. It is the space where God's voice can still be heard, where conviction can still take hold, where another path can still be chosen. Once that silence is broken, once the choice is made, the consequences begin. And sometimes those consequences reshape the world. Chapter 6, The Pact on Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon rises over 9,000 feet above sea level, towering over the landscape of ancient Israel's northern border. Its snow-capped peak is visible from vast distances. In the ancient world, mountains were considered sacred spaces, places where heaven and earth came close together, where the divine and human realms intersected. Mount Hermon had such a reputation. Its name in Hebrew means devoted to destruction or sanctuary. It was a place of power, of presence, of significance, and according to ancient Jewish tradition, it was the location where 200 watchers gathered to make their pact. Enoch 6:6 records, and they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. The name itself became a memorial to their oath, a reminder of the place where angels chose rebellion, where heaven's observers became heaven's exiles. Why Mount Hermon? Why that specific location? The text does not fully explain, but geography and theology intersect here. Mount Hermon stood at the edge of the Promised Land, on the boundary between what God had ordained and what lay beyond. It was liminal space, threshold space, a location that symbolized crossing over. The Watchers chose this mountain because it represented what they were about to do, cross a boundary that should never have been crossed. The pact they made was not casual. It was formal, legal, binding. They swore oaths. They invoked curses upon themselves. They created accountability structures to ensure that none of them would back out. Senjaza, their leader, expressed his fear clearly. I fear you will not agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. He understood the magnitude of what they were planning. He knew judgment would follow, but rather than let that knowledge stop him, he sought to spread the guilt, to ensure that all 200 would share the consequences. This is the logic of conspiracy. Bind others to your crime so that you are not alone in your fall. Like this video if you are seeing parallels to how sin operates today, because the mechanics have not changed. The Watchers knew their plan was evil. They anticipated judgment, and they proceeded anyway, fortified by collective agreement. This is how corruption spreads, not through ignorance but through willful, coordinated rebellion. The names of the leaders are preserved in Enoch 6:7-8. Semjaza, their chief, Arakiba, Ramiel, Kokabio, Tamiel, Ramiel, Daniel, Ezekiel, Barakichul, Azel, Amaros, Batariel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapil, Satarel, Terel, Jomjel, Sariel, Sariel, Terel, Jomjak. 20 leaders over the 200. Each name carried meaning. Each being had a history, a function, a role in the heavenly order, and each one chose to abandon that role for the sake of forbidden desire. They descended, they scattered across the earth, they took human wives, and they began to teach. This is where the corruption deepened. It was not enough for the Watchers to violate the boundary between heaven and earth by taking human wives. They also violated another boundary, the boundary of knowledge. They revealed secrets that were meant to remain hidden. They taught humanity arts and sciences and spiritual techniques that humanity was not ready to possess. Enoch 8 catalogues their teachings. Azazel taught men to make weapons, swords, knives, shields, breastplates. He revealed metallurgy, the forging of tools of war. He also taught women the arts of beautification, cosmetics, jewelry, the use of antimony for the eyes. This might seem trivial, but the text presents it as corruption, as the awakening of vanity and manipulation. Semengers taught enchantments and the cutting of roots, early forms of sorcery and witchcraft. Ormeros taught the breaking of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations and their meanings. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds, weather manipulation, divination. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth, omens and portents. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. These were not neutral sciences. They were spiritual technologies, ways of accessing and manipulating forces that belonged to God's sovereign control. By teaching humanity these secrets, the Watchers gave them tools to grasp at divine power without divine authority. This is the essence of occultism, accessing spiritual realities through forbidden means. The result was predictable. Humanity, already fallen, now armed with knowledge they were not meant to possess, descended into violence, idolatry, and chaos. The earth became corrupt. Genesis 6:11 says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence." The Hebrew word for corrupt is shakath, meaning ruined, spoiled, destroyed. Creation itself was breaking down under the weight of the corruption introduced by the Watchers, and the Nephilim, the offspring of these unions, became living symbols of that corruption. Giants, tyrants, warriors of renown, beings with the strength of angels and the appetites of beasts. They devoured the resources of the earth. They oppressed humanity. They became legends. Share this video because this is the backstory to the flood that most people never hear. The flood was not just about human sin. It was about cleansing genetic and spiritual contamination. It was about removing the Nephilim and imprisoning the Watchers. It was about resetting creation before it spiraled completely beyond redemption. But here is the question that haunts this entire narrative. Did the flood succeed completely? We know it destroyed the Nephilim of that generation. We know it imprisoned the Watchers. But Genesis 6:4 says something chilling. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, after the flood. How? Did some Nephilim survive? Did the Watchers find another way to reproduce their corruption? Did fallen angels continue their work through other means? These questions do not have neat answers, but they point to a reality the Bible affirms again and again. The spiritual war did not end with the flood. It continued, and it continues still. The pact made on Mount Hermon was broken by God's judgment. But the consequences of that pact still ripple through history. The knowledge the Watchers taught is still sought. The boundaries they crossed are still being tested, and the desire to become like gods without submitting to God still burns in the human heart. We are still living in the aftermath of what happened on that mountain. Comment below if you have ever wondered why the Old Testament is so filled with warnings against divination, sorcery, and occult practices. Now you know. Those practices trace back to the Watchers. They are not harmless, they are not neutral. They are doorways to the same rebellion that brought judgment in the days of Noah. Chapter 7, Daughters of Men, Sons of Heaven. The phrase sons of God appears in Genesis 6:2 with a simplicity that hides layers of controversy. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. For centuries, scholars have debated who these sons of God were. Some argue they were the godly line of Seth, men who followed God but married women from the corrupt line of Cain. Others suggest they were human rulers or kings who took multiple wives in polygamous excess. But the most ancient interpretation, held by Jewish scholars before Christ, by the early church fathers and supported by the broader biblical context, is that the sons of God were angelic beings. The Hebrew term B'nai Elohim is used consistently in the Old Testament to refer to spiritual beings. Job 1:6, Job 2:1, Job 38:7 all use this exact phrase for angels in the presence of God. There is no linguistic reason to interpret Genesis 6 differently. The sons of God were angels, and they took human women as wives. This was not romance, it was violation. The text does not describe courtship or mutual love. It describes taking. They took as their wives any they chose. There is force here. There is entitlement. There is the presumption that desire justifies action. The Watchers saw beauty in the daughters of men and decided that beauty belonged to them. They crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, between spirit and flesh, between the permitted and the forbidden. And the result was catastrophe. The women who were taken became mothers to the Nephilim, hybrid beings who were part human, part angelic, fully corrupted. The text does not tell us whether these women consented or were victims. It does not describe their experience. But we can infer from the broader narrative that these unions were not part of God's design. They violated the created order. They produced offspring that should never have existed. And they contributed to the corruption that would necessitate the flood. The daughters of men were caught in a cosmic conflict. They did not initiate and likely did not fully understand. They became vessels for a rebellion that was not their own. Like this video, if you are starting to see that the spiritual realm's interactions with humanity have always been more invasive and dangerous than we were taught. The sons of heaven, the Watchers, were not content to simply observe anymore. They wanted to experience. They wanted to possess. They wanted to participate in the physicality, the intimacy, the embodiment that humanity enjoyed. Angels are spirits. They do not have bodies in the way humans do. They do not reproduce. Jesus said in Matthew 22:30, in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Angels were not designed for marriage or procreation, but the Watchers, in their rebellion, forced themselves into that role anyway. How did they do it? The text does not specify the mechanics, but it clearly affirms the result. Offspring were born. The Nephilim walked the earth. Genesis 6:4 describes them as the mighty men of old, men of renown. Numbers 13:33 identifies them as giants. 33 identifies them as giants. Deuteronomy 2:3 reference their descendants in Canaan. The Nephilim were real, physical, and terrifying. They were also doomed. Enoch 15 records God's judgment on these hybrid beings. But now the giants who are born from the union of the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because their dwelling shall be upon the earth and inside the earth. Evil spirits have come out of their bodies, because from the day that they were created from the sons of God, they have become the Watchers. Their first origin is the spiritual foundation. They will become evil upon the earth and shall be called evil spirits, the dwelling of the spiritual beings of heaven. is heaven, but the dwelling of the spirits of the earth, which are born upon the earth, is in the earth. This passage suggests that when the Nephilim died in the flood, their spirits did not go to the same place human spirits go. They became something else: evil spirits, demons, disembodied entities seeking to inhabit, influence, and corrupt. This interpretation, once common in the early church, has been largely forgotten, but it answers a question the Bible otherwise leaves murky. Where do demons come from? If they are fallen angels, why are they so obsessed with possessing human bodies? Fallen angels have their own spiritual substance. They do not need bodies. But if demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, beings who were born in physical form but lost that form in the flood, their desperation to re-enter physicality makes sense. They remember embodiment, they crave it, and they will do anything to regain it, even temporarily, even partially. This is speculative, but it aligns with the ancient understanding and provides coherence to the biblical narrative. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the parts of Scripture that most people skim over or ignore. Because these details matter, they shape how we understand the spiritual realm, how we interpret Jesus' ministry of deliverance, how we engage in spiritual warfare today. The daughters of men became mothers to monsters, but they were also mothers to legends. The Nephilim became the basis for the myths of every ancient culture: the Greek Titans, the Norse giants, the Sumerian Anunnaki, the heroes of ancient epics, Gilgamesh, Hercules, Achilles. Were these just myths, or were they distorted memories of real beings, hybrids born from the union of heaven and earth, whose exploits terrified and amazed the ancient world? The Bible does not deny the existence of these beings. It affirms them, it names them, it records God's judgment on them, and it warns that their corruption brought the world to the brink of destruction. The flood was necessary not just to cleanse human sin, but to eradicate the genetic and spiritual contamination introduced by the Watchers. But, as we have already noted, Genesis 6,004 contains that haunting phrase, "And also afterward, after the flood, the Nephilim returned." Somehow, we see them in Numbers 13 when the Israelite spies return from Canaan and report, "We saw the Nephilim there." The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. We see them in the giants that Israel fought. Og, king of Bashan, whose bed was 13 feet long. Goliath of Gath, over 9 feet tall, clad in armor, defying the armies of the living God. The sons of Anak, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzamim. These were not normal humans. They were remnants, echoes, perhaps even resurgences of the Nephilim line. How they survived or re-emerged is a mystery. Scripture does not fully unpack, but their presence in the land of Canaan explains why God commanded Israel to destroy them utterly, to leave no survivors, to eradicate them completely. This was not genocide, it was spiritual warfare. The Canaanite giants were not innocent victims. They were carriers of corruption, descendants of a line that should have ended in the flood, and God used Israel as his instrument to finish what the flood began. Share this with someone who struggles with the violent conquest narratives in Joshua and Judges. The context changes everything. Chapter 8. The Nephilim Rising. The Nephilim were not just tall humans, they were something else entirely. Genesis 6:4 calls them Gibborim, mighty ones, warriors, men of renown. The word Nephilim itself comes from the Hebrew root nephil, meaning to fall. They were the fallen ones, not in the sense of moral descent, though that was true, but in the sense of origin. They fell from heaven, or more accurately, they were born from beings who fell from heaven. They were hybrids, part human and part angelic, carrying the DNA of two incompatible realms. And that mixture produced beings of extraordinary power, size, and violence. Ancient texts describe them in terrifying detail. The Book of Enoch says they grew to enormous heights, consuming the resources of the earth so rapidly that humanity could not keep up. Enoch 7:25 records, and they became pregnant, and they bore great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. 3,000 eels would be approximately 4,500 feet, clearly a symbolic exaggeration meant to convey their monstrous nature rather than literal measurement. But the core description is consistent. The Nephilim were violent, they were predatory, they consumed everything in their path, they turned on humanity, they turned on creation itself, they even turned on each other. This was not just moral corruption, it was ontological corruption. These beings were wrong at the level of existence. They violated the structure of reality. They were abominations in the most literal sense, beings whose very existence mocked the order God had established, and their presence on the earth filled it with violence. Genesis 6:11 says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence." The Hebrew word for violence is hamas, meaning cruelty, injustice, brutality. The same word appears in prophetic texts describing the worst evils of human civilization. The Nephilim were not just strong, they were cruel, they dominated, they destroyed, they made the earth unlivable, and God saw it. Genesis 6:5-6 records his response. "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." This is one of the most poignant passages in all of Scripture. God grieved. Not with regret over a mistake, God does not make mistakes, but with sorrow over the corruption of what he had made good. The Hebrew word atzab conveys pain, grief, woundedness. God was wounded by what the earth had become, and that grief moved him to act. So the Lord said, "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." This was not caprice. This was necessity. The corruption had reached a tipping point. If God did not intervene, humanity would be utterly destroyed, not by his judgment, but by the Nephilim and the violence they embodied. Like this video, if you are beginning to see the flood in a completely different light. The flood was not an overreaction to human sin. It was a rescue operation. It was God cleansing the earth of a genetic and spiritual plague that threatened to eradicate humanity altogether. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:9 says, "Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation." Noah walked with God. The phrase blameless in his generation is often taken to mean morally upright, but some scholars argue it also implies genetic purity. Noah's line had not been corrupted by the Watchers. His family carried the pure image of God, untainted by the hybrid contamination spreading through the rest of humanity. This is why God chose Noah, not just because he was righteous, but because through him, humanity could be preserved and restarted. The flood came. It destroyed the Nephilim. It drowned the corruption. It reset the world. But it did not end the story, because Genesis 6:4 says, "And also afterward." After the flood, Nephilim reappeared. We see them in Numbers 13, in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, in Joshua and Judges and 1 and 2 Samuel. The giants returned. How? The text does not fully explain. Some scholars suggest that the corruption survived through one of Noah's daughters-in-law, Ham's wife perhaps, carrying the Nephilim gene. Others propose that fallen angels continued their work after the flood, producing new generations of hybrids. Still others argue that the Nephilim mentioned after the flood were not literal descendants, but simply very tall humans whom the Israelites feared and compared to the legendary giants of old. Each view has strengths and weaknesses, but the simplest reading of the text suggests continuity. The Nephilim line somehow persisted. And God's command to Israel to destroy them utterly was not arbitrary violence. It was the continuation of the cleansing that began with the flood. The giants of Canaan, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the sons of Anak, Og king of Bashan with his massive bed, Goliath of Gath with his defiant challenge, all of these were echoes of the antediluvian Nephilim. They carried the same corruption, they posed the same threat, and they had to be removed. Subscribe if you want to understand the Old Testament conquest narratives through this lens, because it changes everything. When God commanded Israel to destroy entire populations, including women and children, modern readers recoil. It seems like genocide. It seems cruel. But when you understand that these were not ordinary human populations, that they carried genetic and spiritual corruption dating back to the Watchers, that they were the remnants of a line God had already judged in the flood, the command takes on different meaning. It was not ethnic cleansing, it was spiritual warfare. It was the removal of beings who had no right to exist, whose very presence threatened the purity of the line through which the Messiah would come. Because that is the other crucial point. Satan knew the promise. A seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. If Satan could corrupt the human line completely, if he could introduce angelic DNA into every bloodline, the Messiah could not be born as fully human. The promise would fail. Humanity would be lost. The corruption of the Watchers was not random. It was strategic. It was an attempt to prevent the incarnation before it could happen. And God countered it with the flood and later with the conquest of Canaan, ensuring that a pure line remained through which Christ could come. This is why the genealogies matter. This is why the Bible traces lineages so carefully. This is why certain tribes had to be destroyed utterly. The stakes were cosmic. The battle was not just for land, it was for the future of redemption itself. The Nephilim rising was not just a historical curiosity, it was a satanic strategy. And God's response was decisive, relentless, and ultimately victorious. But the question remains, if Nephilim appeared after the flood, could they appear again? Are there still giants, literal or spiritual, walking the earth? Are there still beings who carry the corruption of the Watchers? And if the boundary between heaven and earth was crossed once, could it be crossed again? Share this video because these questions are not academic. They touch on realities that still affect us today. The spiritual realm is not inactive. The war is not over, and the tactics of the enemy have not changed as much as we might think. The Nephilim may be gone, but their legacy endures. Chapter 9, Forbidden Knowledge Unleashed. The Watchers did not just corrupt humanity through intermarriage, they corrupted humanity through intermarriage. They corrupted humanity through education. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of Genesis 6 and the expanded narrative in the book of Enoch. The fallen angels brought knowledge from heaven to earth, secrets that were never meant to be revealed, technologies and techniques that humanity was not ready to wield. And that knowledge, once released, could not be taken back. It spread, it evolved, it shaped civilizations, and it continues to influence the world today. Enoch 8 catalogues the forbidden teachings in chilling detail. Azazel, one of the chief watchers, taught men the art of war. He showed them how to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He revealed metallurgy, the manipulation of metals from the earth. Before this, humanity had simpler tools, stone and wood, but Azazel introduced weapons designed specifically for killing other humans. He did not just teach technology, he taught violence as craft, as art, as science, and the result was predictable. Warfare exploded, bloodshed multiplied, the earth filled with violence. But Azazel did not stop with weapons. He also taught women the arts of beautification, cosmetics, jewelry, the use of antimony to darken the eyelids. This might seem trivial compared to weapons, but the text presents it as equally corrupting. Why? Because it awakened vanity, manipulation, seduction. It introduced the idea that external appearance could be crafted, controlled, weaponized. humanity began to focus on surfaces, on illusions, on the cultivation of desire rather than character. This was not innocent fashion, it was the corruption of identity itself. Semjaza, the leader of the Watchers, taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. This was sorcery, the use of plants and rituals to manipulate spiritual forces. It was early pharmakeia, the Greek word from which we get pharmacy, but which in the New Testament refers to witchcraft and the use of drugs in occultic practices. Semjaza opened a door to a realm humanity was never meant to enter, a realm where spiritual power could be accessed through technique rather than relationship with God. Other Watchers taught astrology, the reading of the stars to predict the future and discern fate. Kokabel taught the constellations. Barakajal taught astrology and divination. They revealed that the heavens were not just beautiful, they were meaningful, encoded with messages. But this knowledge was corrupting because it replaced trust in God with trust in systems, in patterns, in fate. It introduced determinism, the idea that human destiny is written in the stars rather than chosen in relationship with the Creator. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds, weather patterns, how to read omens in the sky. Akail taught the signs of the earth, interpreting natural phenomena as messages. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. All of this was divination, the attempt to pierce the veil between present and future, between known and unknown, through forbidden means. God had already established how he would reveal the future, through prophets, through direct communication, through covenant relationship, but the Watchers offered shortcuts, techniques that bypassed obedience and trust. Like this video if you are starting to see how ancient occult practices trace directly back to the rebellion of the Watchers. This is not mythology, this is history. The knowledge the Watchers taught did not disappear. It was passed down. It became the foundation of pagan religions, mystery schools, esoteric traditions. It became alchemy, astrology, divination, sorcery, witchcraft, all the practices the Bible repeatedly condemns. And it became something else. It became the seed of human pride, the belief that we can access divine power without divine submission. This is the heart of all occultism, not the worship of Satan, though that comes later, but the belief that spiritual realities can be manipulated through knowledge, through technique, through will. The Watchers taught humanity that we do not need to wait on God. We can seize what we want. We can know what he has not revealed. We can become like gods ourselves. This was the same lie the serpent told Eve in the garden. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. And it is the same lie whispered in every generation since. The result of this forbidden knowledge was catastrophe. Humanity descended into violence, idolatry, corruption, and chaos. Genesis 6:4 summarizes the state of the world. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intention only evil continually. This was not just moral failure. This was the comprehensive collapse of civilization. And at the root of it was knowledge that humanity was not ready to possess. Knowledge that corrupted rather than enlightened. Subscribe because this is the backstory to every biblical warning against occult practices, and most Christians have no idea it exists. When Deuteronomy 18 commands, "There shall not be found among you anyone who practices divination, or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord." It is not arbitrary legalism. It is protection. These practices trace back to the Watchers. They open doors that should remain closed. They invite influence from beings who are not benevolent. The New Testament continues the warning. Galatians 5:20 lists sorcery, pharmakeia, among the works of the flesh that exclude people from the kingdom of God. Revelation 21:8 declares that sorcerers will have their portion in the lake of fire. Revelation 22:15 excludes them from the New Jerusalem. This is serious. This is not cultural prejudice. This is spiritual reality. The knowledge the Watchers unleashed is still circulating. It is in New Age practices, in modern witchcraft, in astrology apps, in occult-themed entertainment. It is packaged as harmless, as empowering, as liberating. But it is the same old poison in new bottles, and it still corrupts, because the goal has not changed. The enemy still wants humanity to seek power apart from God, to access spiritual realities through forbidden means, to believe the lie that we can become like gods without submitting to the one true God. The Watchers are imprisoned, but their teachings walk free, and every generation must choose. Will we seek God on His terms through His revealed word and covenant relationship? Or will we chase after forbidden knowledge, convinced that we know better, that we can handle what our ancestors could not? Comment below if you have ever been tempted by practices like astrology, tarot, or other forms of divination. No judgment, just honesty. Because recognizing the source helps us understand the danger. The knowledge the Watchers taught was not neutral, it was weaponized. It was designed to lead humanity away from God, not toward Him, and it worked. The world filled with violence and corruption. And God, in His grief and His justice, decided to cleanse the earth. The flood was coming. But before the waters rose, God sent a preacher, a man named Enoch, who walked with God and warned his generation. And after Enoch, a man named Noah, who built an ark and offered one final chance for repentance. The forbidden knowledge had been unleashed, but mercy was still available. Judgment was certain. But salvation was offered, and that pattern, judgment and mercy, condemnation and grace, would echo through all of history, from the flood to the cross to the final judgment yet to come. The Watchers taught humanity how to rebel, and that story, the story of redemption, is the only story powerful enough to undo the corruption the Watchers introduced. Share this video, because the battle between forbidden knowledge and revealed truth is still raging, and every soul must choose which voice to follow. Chapter 10, The Judgment. Nobody saw coming. Judgment always seems sudden to those who refuse to see the signs. But God does not act impulsively. He does not strike without warning. He does not punish without cause or announcement. The judgment on the Watchers and on the corrupted world they created was no exception. It came swiftly, but it did not come without warning. Genesis 6:3 records God's decree, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." This was not a declaration about human lifespan. It was a countdown. God was giving humanity 120 years to repent, to turn back, to abandon the corruption that had filled the earth. And during those 120 years, Noah built the ark, and by building it, he preached. 2 Peter 2005 calls Noah a herald of righteousness. Every swing of the hammer was a sermon. Every plank of wood laid was a warning. The ark itself, rising on dry land far from any ocean, was a prophetic sign. Something was coming. Judgment was approaching, and mercy was still available for those who would listen. But nobody listened. Jesus said in Matthew 24:37-39, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." They were unaware, not because there were no signs, but because they refused to see them. Life continued as normal. Pleasure, commerce, relationships, all the rhythms of daily existence proceeded without interruption until the rain began, and by then it was too late. The judgment nobody saw coming was the judgment everyone should have seen, because God had been shouting warnings for over a century. Like this video if you see the parallels to our own time, because they are unmistakable. The Watchers also faced judgment, but theirs was different from humanity's. Humans who rejected Noah's message died in the flood, but death for a human means the body perishes and the spirit goes to its appointed place. The Watchers, being angelic, could not die in that way, so God imprisoned them. 2 Peter 2:4 says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment." The word translated hell here is Tartarus, a Greek term referring to the deepest abyss, a place of punishment lower than Hades. The Watchers were not just judged, they were locked away in the darkest corners of the spiritual realm, held in chains, awaiting final sentencing. Jude 6 adds detail, "And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day." They left their proper dwelling. They abandoned their assigned place. They crossed a boundary they had no right to cross, and for that they were imprisoned in a place from which there is no escape, no appeal, no hope. The Book of Enoch describes their punishment in vivid, haunting language. Enoch was taken in visions to the places where the Watchers were held. He saw them in chains, in darkness, in torment. Enoch 10:4-6 records God's command to the archangel Raphael, "Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudalel, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire." Azazel, one of the chief Watchers, the one who taught humanity weapons and vanity, was bound and buried in darkness, and he will remain there until the final day, when he will be thrown into the lake of fire. The other Watchers received similar sentences. Enoch 10:11-12 records the command to the archangel Michael regarding the rest of the fallen angels. "Go, bind Semjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated." 70 generations. That is a symbolic number meaning a long, indefinite period. The Watchers were imprisoned not for a short time, but for ages until the final judgment. They have been in that state for thousands of years, and they remain there still. But here is the chilling part. The Watchers, even in chains, did not remain silent. They begged for mercy. Enoch 13 describes how the Watchers, realizing their fate, asked Enoch to intercede for them. They wanted him to petition God on their behalf, to plead for forgiveness, for a lighter sentence, for any relief from the judgment pronounced against them. Enoch agreed to try. He wrote out their petition. He presented it before the throne of God, and God's response was devastating. Enoch 14:4-7 records, "Go, say to the Watchers of heaven, who have sent you to intercede for them, you should intercede for men, not men for you. Why have you left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as sons? And though you were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and, as the children of men, have lusted after flesh and blood, as those also do who die and perish. Therefore have I given them wives also, that they might impregnate them, and beget children by them, that thus nothing might be wanting to them on earth. But you were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world. And therefore I have not appointed wives for you. For as for the spiritual ones of the heaven, in heaven is their dwelling." God's answer was silence on the request for mercy, but clarity on the reason for judgment. The Watchers had no excuse. They were spiritual beings. They knew the boundaries, they understood the consequences, and they violated everything anyway. There would be no forgiveness, no second chance, no restoration. Their judgment was final. Subscribe if this is making you rethink the nature of spiritual rebellion and the certainty of divine justice, because this is not abstract theology, this is reality. The Watchers sinned with full knowledge, and for that, they received a sentence from which there is no appeal. But what about their offspring, the Nephilim? They were not angels, they were born in physical bodies. They lived, they ate, they fought, they died. And when they died in the flood, something happened to them. Something the Bible hints at but does not fully explain. Enoch 15,800 says, "And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling." Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies. Because they are born from men and from the holy Watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. This passage suggests that when the Nephilim died, their spirits did not go to Sheol like human spirits. They became something else. Disembodied spirits, evil spirits, demons. This interpretation has ancient support. It explains why demons seem so desperate to possess human bodies. They once had bodies, they lost them, and they crave that physicality again. It explains why Jesus' ministry involved so much deliverance, so many confrontations with demons. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim were still active, still malevolent, still seeking to corrupt and destroy. And it explains why the spiritual realm is so densely populated with hostile forces. The Watchers are imprisoned, but the spirits of their offspring roam free, seeking whom they may devour, until the final judgment when they too will be cast into the lake of fire. The judgment nobody saw coming had layers. The flood judged humanity and destroyed the Nephilim's bodies. The imprisonment of the Watchers removed the angelic conspirators, but the spiritual consequences lingered. Demons remained, corruption persisted, and the battle between good and evil, between God's kingdom and Satan's rebellion, intensified. That battle continues. The Watchers are in chains, but their legacy is active, and we live in the aftermath in a world still scarred by their rebellion, still haunted by the evil they unleashed. Share this video, because understanding the judgment of the Watchers helps us understand the world we live in now. The spiritual war is real. The enemy is ancient, and the victory has already been won by Christ, but the battle still rages until he returns. Chapter 11. Why the flood wasn't just about Noah. When we tell the story of Noah, we focus on the ark, the animals, the rainbow, the promise. It is a story of salvation, of faithfulness, of God's mercy preserving a remnant, and all of that is true. But the flood was not primarily about Noah. It was about cleansing. It was about removing a corruption so deep, so pervasive, so dangerous that it threatened the entire future of humanity and the plan of redemption. The flood was God's reset button, a cosmic do-over, a purging of genetic and spiritual contamination that had brought creation to the brink of total collapse. Genesis 6,001:13 explains God's reasoning. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. The word corrupt appears 3 times in 2 verses. This was not minor moral failure. This was systemic breakdown. All flesh had corrupted their way. The corruption was universal. But what does all flesh mean? Was every single human evil? What about children? What about infants? This question has troubled readers for centuries, but when we understand the context of the Watchers and the Nephilim, the picture clarifies. The corruption was not just moral, it was genetic. The interbreeding between fallen angels and human women had introduced something into the human gene pool that did not belong there. The image of God in humanity was being systematically erased, replaced by a hybrid corruption that could not be allowed to continue. If the corruption spreads to every human line, the promise given in Genesis 3:15 could not be fulfilled. God had declared that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, but that seed had to be fully human. If every human line carried angelic DNA, the Messiah could not be born as the Son of Man. The promise would fail. Redemption would be impossible. The flood was not genocide. It was the preservation of humanity itself. And Noah was chosen not just because he was righteous, but because his line was still pure. Genesis 6:49 says Noah was blameless in his generations. The Hebrew word tamim can mean morally blameless, but it can also mean genetically pure, without defect. Noah's genealogy was untainted by the corruption of the Watchers. Through him, the true human line could continue. Like this video if this is the first time you have heard the flood explained this way, because it changes everything. The flood was not about God losing his temper over human sin. It was about God protecting the future of redemption. The rain that fell for 40 days and 40 nights, the waters that covered the mountains, the destruction that swept away every living thing, it was all aimed at one goal: removing the Nephilim and their corruption from the earth. The Watchers had already been imprisoned, but their offspring still lived, and those offspring, the giants, the mighty men, the men of renown, had to be destroyed. They could not be redeemed. They were not fully human. They were not fully human. They were abominations, beings whose very existence violated the created order, and so God drowned them. But he saved Noah. He saved 8 souls. He saved representatives of the animal kingdom. He preserved the good part of his creation while purging the corrupted part. This was not cruelty. It was surgery. It was the removal of a cancer that threatened to kill the entire body. And after the flood, God made a promise. Genesis 8:21-22 records, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." God promised he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. He set the rainbow in the sky as a sign of that covenant. But notice what he did not promise. He did not promise that corruption would never return. He did not promise that giants would never reappear. He did not promise that spiritual rebellion would cease. And in fact, it did not cease. Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. After the flood, giants returned. How? The text does not explain fully, but we see them in Numbers 13, in the land of Canaan. The spies report, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak who come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The giants were back. Either the corruption somehow survived through one of Noah's descendants, possibly through a daughter-in-law carrying the gene, or fallen angels renewed their activity after the flood, producing new hybrids. Either way, the problem persisted, and God's solution persisted as well. He commanded Israel to destroy them utterly, to finish the cleansing that the flood began. Subscribe, because this is the lens through which the conquest of Canaan must be understood. When God told Israel to destroy the Canaanites completely, including women and children, modern readers are horrified. It seems like ethnic cleansing. It seems cruel. But when you understand that the Canaanite populations included descendants of the Nephilim, genetic carriers of a corruption that threatened the line of the Messiah, the command takes on a different light. It was not arbitrary violence. It was the continuation of the purging that began with the flood. It was spiritual warfare at the highest level. The stakes were not just land, they were the future of salvation. If the Nephilim line corrupted Israel, the Messiah could not come. The promise would fail, humanity would be lost, so God used Israel as his instrument to remove the corruption. And when Israel failed to fully obey, when they left survivors, when they intermarried with the Canaanites, they paid a terrible price. Corruption crept back in. Idolatry spread. spiritual compromise became the norm, and eventually, Israel itself faced judgment and exile. The flood was not just about Noah, it was about preserving the plan of redemption. It was about ensuring that one day a fully human Messiah could be born, live, die, and rise again to crush the serpent's head and redeem humanity from sin. The flood was a necessary step in the long war between God and Satan, between the kingdom of light and the forces of darkness, and understanding that helps us see the bigger picture. Every event in Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, is part of that war. Every promise, every judgment, every deliverance, every exile, they all fit into the unfolding plan of redemption. The flood was not an isolated event, it was a critical moment in the cosmic battle, and it succeeded. The corruption was purged, the line was preserved, and centuries later, in the fullness of time, Jesus was born, fully human, fully divine, the seed of the woman, the one who would crush the serpent's head. The flood made that possible. Share this video, because the story of Noah is so much bigger than we were taught. It is not a children's story about animals on a boat. It is a war story. A story about God's relentless pursuit of redemption, his refusal to let corruption win, his willingness to do whatever it takes to save humanity. That is the God we serve. And that is the story we must tell. Chapter 12. The giants who survived the floodwaters receded. The ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. Noah and his family stepped out onto a cleansed earth. Every living thing that had been outside the ark was dead. The Nephilim were gone. The corruption was purged. Or was it? Genesis 6:4 contains a phrase that has troubled scholars and theologians for centuries. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And also afterward? After what? After the flood. The giants returned. Somehow, impossibly, the Nephilim reappeared. How is that possible? If the flood destroyed all flesh outside the ark, if only Noah and his family survived, how did the Nephilim line continue? There are several theories, and none of them have unanimous scholarly support, but each is worth considering because the biblical text is clear. The giants came back, and Israel was commanded to destroy them. Theory 1. The genes survived through Noah's family, specifically through one of his son's wives. Genesis 6:9 says Noah was blameless in his generations, which many interpret as genetic purity, but it does not say the same about his sons' wives. If one of them, perhaps Ham's wife, carried Nephilim DNA, even as a recessive gene, that could explain how giants reappeared after the flood. The offspring would not be full Nephilim, but they would carry the trait. Over generations, as populations grew and spread, the gene could express itself again, producing individuals or tribes of unusual size and strength. This theory has the advantage of maintaining the integrity of the flood narrative. Everyone outside the ark died, but a genetic marker survived inside the ark, unknowingly carried by one of the women. Theory 2. Fallen angels resumed their activity after the flood. The watchers themselves were imprisoned, but perhaps other fallen angels, those who did not participate in the original rebellion, saw what the watchers had done and repeated it. This theory is supported by the phrase in Genesis 6:4, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man. The phrasing suggests an ongoing or repeated action, not just a one-time event before the flood. If fallen angels continued to take human wives after the flood, new generations of Nephilim could be born. Theory 3. The term Nephilim as used after the flood is not literal, but comparative. When the Israelite spies in Numbers 13 say, "We saw the Nephilim there," they might have been using the term loosely to describe very tall, fearsome warriors, not literal descendants of the original Nephilim. This theory is the least satisfying because it does not account for the biblical text's consistent use of specific terminology and genealogies. The giants of Canaan were not just tall humans. They were described with distinct tribal names: Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzamim, These were real populations with real lineages. Like this video if you think Theory 1 or Theory 2 is more plausible, or comment below with your own take, because this is one of the most debated questions in biblical scholarship, and it matters. It matters because the command to destroy these populations is only morally coherent if we understand who and what they were. If they were ordinary humans, the conquest narratives are horrific. But if they were carriers of a genetic and spiritual corruption that threatened the plan of redemption, the command makes sense. God was not commanding genocide. He was commanding the removal of a cancer. Let us look at the biblical evidence for giants after the flood. Numbers 13:33 records the spies sent to scout the land of Canaan. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." The spies explicitly call them Nephilim and trace their lineage to the Anakim. This was not metaphor. This was genealogy. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 describes other giant tribes. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. Deuteronomy 2:10-20-21 mentions yet another tribe. It is also counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzamim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place. These were real tribes. They had names, they had territories, they were known for their size and strength, and they were systematically destroyed, either by God directly or by the nations he empowered to remove them. Deuteronomy 3:1. Glyphon 1 gives us specific measurement. For only Og the king of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. 9 cubits is approximately 13 feet. Og's bed was 13 feet long, even allowing for some exaggeration or the possibility that the bed was larger than necessary. This suggests a man of extraordinary size. Og was a giant, and he was the last of the Rephaim in that region. Israel destroyed him and his people at God's command. 1 Samuel 17 introduces us to the most famous giant of all, Goliath of Gath. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, that is over 9 feet tall. He was a warrior, feared by the entire Israelite army, and he defied the living God, until a shepherd boy named David, empowered by faith, struck him down with a stone. Subscribe, because the story of David and Goliath is not just a tale of courage. It is the continuation of the ancient war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Goliath was a descendant of the Nephilim. David was in the line of the Messiah. When David struck down Goliath, he was participating in the same cleansing that began with the flood and continued through the conquest of Canaan. He was removing a remnant of the corruption that threatened God's people and God's plan. 2 Samuel 21:15-22 records additional encounters with giants. There was war again with the Philistines at Gob, and Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. 4 more giants, all killed by David or his men, all described as descendants of the giants. One had 6 fingers and 6 toes, a genetic anomaly that suggests something abnormal in his lineage. These were not myths, they were historical records. The giants survived the flood. They established themselves in Canaan, and God used Israel to finish what the flood started. By the time of David, the Nephilim line was nearly extinct. A few scattered remnants remained, but they were hunted down and destroyed. The cleansing was complete. The line of the Messiah was secure, and centuries later, Jesus was born. Fully human, fully divine, the promised seed who would crush the serpent's head. The giants who survived the flood were a persistent threat, but they were not an unstoppable threat. God had a plan, and he executed it over centuries, through judges, through kings, through warriors who fought in faith. The giants are gone, but their story remains, a testimony to the reality of the spiritual war, the depth of the corruption introduced by the Watchers, and the relentless faithfulness of God to preserve his plan of redemption. Share this video, because this is not ancient history. It is the foundation of the gospel. The Messiah came because God preserved a pure line through Noah, through Abraham, through David, and every giant that fell was a step toward the cross, a victory in the long war that would culminate in the resurrection and the defeat of death itself. The giants are gone, but the war continues, and we are part of it. Stay vigilant, stay faithful, because the enemy is still active, but the victory is already won.